Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our series, Balancing Biodiversity Conservation with Development Pressure in Urban Landscapes. My name is Purnima Govindrajlu, and I'm the Unit Head of Species Conservation Science Unit in the Ecosystem and Biodiversity Branch in the BC Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship, affectionately called the Walrus. I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Wasanich people here in sunny but cold southern Vancouver Island. Please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands that you're joining us from today. We are very excited to have you join us today. This webinar is part of a series that runs every Tuesday. It started last week and it'll go on till the 18th of March. And it's a collaboration between Walrus and the Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative. It is designed to explore the complex challenges of balancing rapid development with the vital need to conserve our biodiversity. Especially as housing demands continue to rise, municipalities and regional districts are facing increasing pressure to accommodate growth, but we have to simultaneously protect our natural environment. In the series, we'll cover several topics, including regulatory frameworks and policy, provincial best practices, mitigation guidelines, and planning tools. Today's webinar, Planning for Nature and Growing Communities, we are joined by two presenters from local governments. Jennifer Miles is with the City of Kelowna and is presenting on protecting biodiversity in one of the fastest growing communities in Canada. And Nancy Gothard from the City of Courtenay is presenting on integrating community planning tools for nature protection. Okay, before we get started, a few housekeeping things. Both presenters will give their presentation and then we'll have a dedicated question and answer session. Familiarize yourself with the Q&A icon at the bottom in your toolbar. That is what we'll use for all the questions. Since we'll be moving directly into the question and answer period after both presentations, you can keep posting your questions throughout the presentations. Also, don't forget that you can, if you see a question that you're also interested in, use the upvoting icon to upvote the question, because at the end, I will prioritize the questions that have the most thumbs up as upvoted, so we can answer questions that's of most interest to the audience. The chat has been enabled and will be monitored by Ali and Danielle from Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative. If you have technical issues, check your internet connection, try refreshing your browser. If you're still having problems, put a note in the chat and Ali will try her best to help you. If all else fails, the webinar is recorded and will be available within a week on TNCC's website. Also, just a reminder that there'll be a quick survey at the end of this webinar. All right, now with that housekeeping out of the way and before the presentation, we'd like to move into a little icebreaker just to see where everybody is from. So there's a link in your chat or it's on the screen. You can also use your mobile device to use the QR code and it will take you to a website where you can drop a pin to show us where you're joining us from. The website will show us in real time where people are joining us, and Ali will bring that up on the screen once people are able to go join and start dropping pins. We'll just give you a few minutes, well, maybe a minute to do that. Again, you can use the QR code using your mobile device, or you can click on the link in the chat function. It should open up a separate window on your browser and take us to the site. I'm sure Ali is working in the background to bring up the map. So if you're from BC, click on approximately the location that you're joining us from. And if you're from outside BC, click on the globe icon that's on the website. Okay, I see that the screen is coming up. Whoa, wow. There are quite a few people from outside of BC. Again, most people are joining us from the southern part of the province. It's not surprising. That's where development pressures are highest. And also a few people going up on the northern part of the province. So that's really great. There's more people adding dots, so we'll just wait just a second more. And of course, we'll have a screenshot to join to show where everyone is joining us from. All right, so we've got a great audience and also good representation from around BC, but also outside of BC. That's really interesting. Okay, I'm going to get started with introducing our first speaker for today, and that's Jennifer Miles. Our first speaker is a planner specialist with the City of Kelowna, Climate Action and Environmental Stewardship Department. Jen focuses on building Kelowna's climate resilience through nature-based solutions, including policy work on initiatives like the city's Sustainable Urban Forest Strategy. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks so much. I'll just share my screen now. Well, hello everyone, and I'm so glad to be here with you today on the unceded traditional territory of the Silks Okanagan people coming from the city of Kelowna, where I work. And I'm so glad to share a bit of what we've been doing here in Kelowna to address development pressures on biodiversity. Kelowna was the fastest growing area or urban area in Canada between 2016 and 2021, which placed incredible pressure on our housing stock to meet that demand. But I'm sure a lot of folks on this call can relate to those same pressures. My presentation will be focusing on the layers of planning tools that we've used here to try and reduce urban sprawl and help direct that growth into multi-unit housing concentrated in our city's urban centers. I'll also touch on some of our policies and bylaws more directly focused on protecting biodiversity, but I hope that you'll come away from this talk seeing the value of focusing development energy in a good way, encouraging complete compact communities with the co-benefits of reduced encroachment into our forests and grasslands. So for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the Okanagan, we're lucky enough to be situated on beautiful Lake Okanagan, surrounded by grasslands and forests. We were a sleepy agricultural town, so these towers you see in the image are a relatively new addition, built mostly within the last decade, and you can see more tower cranes to the left edge. It has been a challenge to encourage this densification, even with the recognition of all this population growth coming to our community. And densification in all of its forms is often vigorously opposed. So a strong official community plan rooted in intensive public engagement was critical to addressing this challenge here in Kelowna. Our planning team made a concerted effort to link the co-benefits of avoiding costly infrastructure expansion and the protection of these grasslands and forests by discouraging new suburbs. So before I get into those policies, I wanted to start with some statistics indicating that we are moving in the right directions for our goals. Last year, we completed an update of our sensitive ecosystem inventory, Due to the in-depth analysis and reassessment of the provincial methodologies for SEIs, we are looking at 2021 data, and it took several years to assess some of the data gaps through the SEI process. It wasn't capturing the important young forest areas of our communities. So now we actually have a really good comparison with our population growth based on the census in 2021. So we can see that we grew by almost 30%, while the loss of natural spaces was close to around 12%. So it was an interesting thing to look at, but we don't want to just look at one stat. We are also looking at our building permits processing. And this graph shows that the majority of our new residential construction is happening in our urban centers, which are shown in purple on this map. Those are a subzone within our core area, indicated in orange. And you can see here that our official community plan has really directed that growth into those core areas. The plan also set a permanent growth boundary to discourage development in the rural portions of the city. Those are shown in green. And basically that boundary is the dividing line between the yellow and green areas. But it's really not a standalone line. Many existing land use policies drove where it was placed, and having it identified helps reinforce those policies. So this is going to be a common theme in our talk today, is the layering of protections being so important. So to balance off that deterrence of suburban growth, the Kelowna's planning team has developed zoning bylaw incentives to encourage development in the urban centers. We have pre-zoning, and we've identified locations for infill housing to encourage that development in the core. The map at the top left there of the blue blobs was created to highlight locations perfect for infill housing based on their lot size and servicing considerations. We wanted to make it easy to identify sites to build on. And we also wanted to help encourage families to choose to not go to the suburbs by offering a range of infill housing options. We've also reduced permit approval times for these kinds of infill projects to help also encourage development in these areas. And Kelowna was doing all of this before the province's Bill 44 was enacted to increase density across the board on all single detached residential housing zones. So that bill was an important acknowledgement of what we were doing made sense. But the bill did so with quite a broad brush, covering those rural locations that we need to look at managing development on in a different way. So Kelowna has been careful to make sure we can still enforce other tools to discourage development around our wildfire interface and environmentally sensitive areas. And I really appreciated hearing about a report last week from the Canadian Climate Institute. It was called Close to Home. And it highlighted the value of discouraging housing in these high-risk locations, as a very small amount of housing that would be built there would not be worth the effort. And it was really summed up by a quote from that report where they said, the most affordable home is the one you don't have to rebuild after a disaster. So other ways that we've attempted to encourage that densification is focusing infrastructure resources on our core. I really love to highlight our transportation department's quick build program here, where we've used planters to define bike lanes in a really cost-effective way, but it also helps out our pollinators and it improves our urban biodiversity. And we really struggle with planting larger areas in Kelowna's dry climate. So planters like this are actually really easy for our parks department to maintain. They're low maintenance, and here we have a mix of perennials that includes some native flowers as well. So this incentive is actually less for the developer and more for our council decision makers. Kelowna created Model City Infrastructure as an analysis tool to explore the long-term costs associated with operating and maintaining and even replacing a neighborhood's infrastructure. And it compares those costs with the long-term taxation revenue that would come from that neighborhood. So you can see the areas with the biggest deficit and would be the most expensive to maintain over their lifespan would be the areas in red on this map. And of course, they coincide with those rural edge areas of the city. So combined, these policies and decision-making tools have proven to deter the approval of greenfield development projects. And we've had a recent example of that being in the Thompson Flats area. It was proposed just outside the permanent growth boundary shown here in the brown dotted line. And an analysis using the model city infrastructure tool estimated at an almost 45% revenue shortfall, which would equate to an average deficit of approximately 1.4 million every year to service this kind of new neighborhood. That was a good amount of information that our council decision makers could use when they're deliberating on those kinds of projects. So now I'll move more into some of our policy tools and bylaws that are more commonly thought of to regulate natural area protections and protecting green space. And that's our development permit areas. We require farm DPs to create buffers against our ALR. And while, of course, actively farmed areas are meant for farming, they do help structure our permanent growth boundary, and you can kind of see the light green areas here following that permanent growth boundary line. We also have hazardous condition development permit areas, and that's the black cross hatching on this map. And those indicate the steep slopes that would be geotechnically challenging to develop, but they're also very important areas for wildlife movement. And then, of course, the natural environment development permit area with the green lines to identify those environmentally sensitive locations. So the NEDPA has been a part of Kelowna's official community plan for over 15 years. It sets up our jurisdictional authority to meet or beat the provincial riparian areas protection regulation, the RAPR. And the area applies to quite a significant area of the city, covering both aquatic and terrestrial areas. But I would note that this DP requirement is triggered at the discretion of staff because we have large areas of aquifers, which are critical for our drinking water supply, but they're under already developed lands in the Rutland Urban Center, for example, within our permanent growth boundary. So in those cases, an environmental DP isn't triggered unless well drilling is involved. The DP area was originally developed based on the sensitive ecosystem inventory that was done around 2011. So it is definitely in need of an update, and we're looking to do that with the data we collected from the 2021 analysis, and also looking to update it with some of the biodiversity corridor research that UBC Okanagan has completed, as you can kind of see noting skirting the city and also going through our northeast quadrant. So as part of our official community plan, we've identified the DP area's riparian buffer widths, and we call this the riparian management area, which is somewhat similar to the SPIA in the wrapper, but a little bit different in that we have set measurements listed out for each waterway. And it is quite helpful to do this to speed up the identification of a setback in our urban areas. So we're encouraging the process of environmental assessment to be more focused on the beneficial protections and restoration in those situations. We generally use a 15-meter setback, but the area does expand around some of our waterways like Mission Creek, where we've put a 50-meter setback RMA due to the size and flood potential of that waterway. So by identifying these areas, we've placed no net loss of any habitat around our RMAs. And so we follow that very standard hierarchy of protections: avoid, protect, mitigate, and compensate. This approach really helps to focus conversations around development near RMAs to completely staying outside of it. And by setting the 15-meter setback, that usually is an achievable requirement in most urban lots. And we've also made it clear to any development applicants that compensation for any encroachment into the RMA must be found on site. So it's often not economical to lose that developable land to compensation. So we very rarely see any proposals, even at the get-go, to encroach into the riparian management area. Any kind of proposal that would seek to do encroachment would have to be based on a very significant hardship. And in those cases, we may consider off-site compensation payments, but that's really a last resort and only considered for things like a major public good like a bridge. So the environmental assessment process applies to both our aquatic and terrestrial areas, as mentioned, and we really encourage the assessment to focus on current features observed and potential impacts. Any kind of past disturbance may have degraded a site, but if sufficient time has passed, the vegetation regrowth and wildlife use on the site currently is of the top consideration we want to see in those environmental assessments and used to direct the identification of environmentally sensitive areas. We request that an ESA be identified prior to siting of the development project so that the disturbance footprint of the development can be constrained away from any very high value ESA areas, what we call our ESA 1. And then we set our second level of no net loss of ESA 2 areas, which may allow for some compensation if encroachment is necessary. We understand that a lot of our environmental professionals struggle with being brought into a project early on. So every chance we get, city staff remind the development community that it is a significant cost savings to bring in their QEP right from the start to avoid redesign. And that redesign will be required if a project is encroaching into those very high value environmentally sensitive areas. And we also remind our applicants that the future use of a site is a consideration in any impact assessment. So we work with QEPs to make sure that any future maintenance like mowing won't encroach into the natural area. And if any compensation is proposed, we will not consider it as equivalent if it is at risk of being mown or replaced and removed. We also ask our QEPs to coordinate with the other professional reporting requirements that might be required for civil or geotechnical engineering or wildfire hazard mitigation. And Kelowna combines those DP requirements into one development permit to streamline the review process and take advantage of the property protection motivator that will encourage the development footprint to be as small as possible to avoid those geotechnical or wildfire risks. And of course, we also want to make sure that the application requirements aren't working at cross purposes. So we can't have a vegetation replacement plan of 2-to-1 in the same area where we're asking for removal of vegetation to mitigate wildfire risk. So I thought I'd show one example of a development site that had gone through the assessment process, and you can kind of see here the layout of the final footprint of the development subdivision. Once we've gone through all the impacts expected and limited the disturbance away from any ESA 1 very high value areas, the restoration proposal is then considered and determined if there's adequate compensation if there was any encroachment into the ESA 2. And that restoration proposal has to provide contiguous habitat connections. We won't consider isolated patches surrounded by lawn or meadow strips, again, at high risk of removal. And here we've made sure that wildlife corridors are connected to the northern portion of this area and made sure there's escape routes, and the homes are concentrated at the south end to connect to the existing neighborhood. We also have been asking for more detail in our restoration plans to ensure that adequate resources are being allocated to maintenance. It's so important to invest in maintenance, and sometimes it's worth it to cut back on plants to be able to fund enough maintenance over the term of establishment for new vegetation because of the extreme weather events that we're seeing in our area. And this is an example of that level of detail that we're looking for. The city requires this cost estimate as part of our performance security requirements. And the performance security cost must cover both the installation of the plants and any other features of the restoration, but also the maintenance, as I've mentioned, and monitoring by the qualified environmental professional. So the performance security would be held by the city until we see successful establishment and a high rate of survivorship, usually over 80%. And that's following the 3 to 5 year, or in some cases, 10-year period. And of course, we hold that money in case the site is abandoned and we would undertake that establishment ourselves. But we've had very rare cases of needing to do that because we do try to work with the landowner over many years to replant and replace where they've had challenges. And highlighting things like beaver protection for plants is a really important level of detail that we've gone to help support successful restoration. So to sum up, I wanted to touch on some of the pros and cons of local government enforcement of essentially wrapper and natural environment development permitting. Local staff have that background to help guide professionals and link the environmental assessment to the larger development permit requirements set by the local government. And this increases administration efficiency hugely. We also are trying to have consistent reporting requirements, as consultants often feel undercut by competing companies that may have less detail in their restoration plans and cost estimates. So it really helps to have the level of detail that we require. And Kelowna also has the opportunity to follow the delegated approvals model for development permits, so that minimizes the amount of politics influencing those development permit decisions. And then lastly, having local bylaws means more direct and efficient enforcement. And we back up our DP regulations with other bylaws like the soil removal bylaw and the tree protection and natural areas bylaws that provide ticketing options. So a bylaw officer can be sent on site the same day a complaint is filed. But of course, there are challenges, and it's tough for a planner to assess a biologist report and read between the lines to see where QEP may be experiencing pressure from their client to expand a disturbance footprint. And tackling that work can get even harder when a planner needs to review all the permits in a municipality where there is no specialized environmental position. Taking a note from Kelowna's model to set riparian buffer widths with specific measurements can be extremely helpful for planners in those situations. Another point is that local governments don't have the luxury of focusing purely on biodiversity values when assessing their development permits. And council priorities must be considered, particularly in our housing crisis. But with the comments I made earlier in mind to encourage housing development away from our forests and grasslands and waterways has the benefit of protecting those larger high value ecosystem areas, but it may mean compromising on our urban biodiversity. And just as an example here, this is a townhouse development where the proponent was wanting to retain the ponderosa pine that's circled at the top there. But unfortunately, there was some construction damage to the roots, which has caused the tree to decline over several years. And they'd even developed the site plan to have the driveway not impact those trees and come off the lane at the bottom. So they had made the effort to do their best, but sometimes urban tree life expectancy is very limited. So the City of Kelowna has really focused on including requirements to do new tree planting with these kinds of developments. We've also learned from those examples to know that we need to provide more guidance to industry to help them to know when a tree can survive development and what they need to do to protect that tree during construction. So we have a tree condition assessment guide to help development sites when an urban tree has the potential to be retained post-development. And we require an arborist to undertake this assessment so they can identify the critical root zone and understand what techniques could be used during excavation, like the use of an air spade. And of course, doing this kind of assessment with an arborist has a cost. So we've paired this requirement with an incentive for delegated variances, which are essentially a development permitting tool to remove the need to go to council for approval by allowing staff to approve small changes to building setbacks, for example. So in exchange for a building a little closer to a neighbor, we would get to keep an amazing mature tree. And to close out my presentation, I wanted to touch on some of the projects Kelowna has on the horizon to promote urban biodiversity. Our focus has been on setting up standards to better guide design and installation of landscape areas that are climate appropriate. So trees have the best start possible with sufficient soil volumes, for example, to meet their needs. And we're also working with some community partners like the Okanagan Xeriscape Association, who've already done amazing work to assess plants that match our climate. But we're also looking to work with UBC in Vancouver to determine climate appropriate tree species that will be better suited to Kelowna's future climate under those climate change projections. We've also been developing design templates for our infill sites. And one of those includes an enhanced stormwater infiltration area, which is this diagram on the bottom. So we're trying to link stormwater management with getting plants more water. So with that, I'll wrap up and look forward to questions following Nancy's presentation.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was a really informative presentation. It's actually inspiring and exciting to see what can be done with careful planning. So thank you so much. Again, a reminder, we'll hold questions till both presentations are done. Please enter your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom. And now I'll go on to introduce our second presenter of the day. Nancy Gothard has been the driving force behind planning in the rapidly growing community of Courtenay for almost 15 years. As the city's manager of community and sustainable planning, and previously as their first environmental planner, Nancy brings a wealth of experience and a strong sustainability to her work. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Hi there. I think you can hear me now. Great. Thank you for that statement, driving force. I take that as a compliment. Thank you very much. So Courtenay is located entirely within the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. I respectfully acknowledge that, working here, standing here today on those lands. And those lands are actually known as the land of plenty, in large part due to the region's rich terrestrial freshwater and marine biodiversity. So very relevant to the topic today. In the presentation, you're going to find that I'm talking a lot about things that Jennifer talked about. It's so neat to see different communities talking about these things in very similar, but maybe slightly nuanced ways. I happen to be from Kelowna in my teenage years, so I really love hearing what Kelowna is doing. I think they're a real leader. So I'll talk about some of those planning tools. I'll share some technical highlights on a couple of those key tools. So I'll talk a little bit more about our urban forest strategy. I'll talk about the environmental development permit framework and a little bit about our tree bylaw. And then I'll touch on new housing legislation context in a very light way. And then importance of partnership power is how I want to end that. So Courtney is a relatively small rural urban center, 28,000 in a region of approximately 75. We're shaped by water, which forms the majority of our environmentally sensitive areas, such as the Comox estuary, which you see in this quite striking image here. Freshwater aquatic features, they all flow into that estuary. You see the Puntledge River in the foreground, agriculturally flooded lands in the background. And Courtney's been growing at about 11 years in her 5-year census period. So it looked like Kelowna was more in that 3% range of growth, very high. Ours is a little closer to 2. And we are, with our housing needs assessment, recognizing we need about 2,600 new homes in the next 5 years, 8,500 in the next 20 years. That means about 400 per year to be approving. We've been doing that the last couple of years since 2019, mainly through multi-residential form of development. We're really excited to be focusing that growth in that way. All those new housing units, the future ones, will need future land, will require land to be situated on, and where that is channeled is the purpose of community plans, such as regional growth strategies and official community plans. So this image is simply showing the primary growth centers of our region, City of Courtney, Town of Comox. I apologize for not putting the boundaries on there. But our region's growth strategy is informed by principles of smart growth, and an objective of the growth strategy is to frame environmental protection and policies around the principles of precaution, connectivity, and restoration. Great words, laudable policies. Putting them in practice is, I guess, what this is all about, and it can be challenging. But speaking of connectivity and restoration, in particular, we can see here a canopy cover assessment from 2017, and you can see the city's boundaries in the context of the region, and see that there remains significant green field outside our boundaries. Deborah Curran emphasized this in her presentation last week, that focusing growth, and I'd add delaying or even avoiding expanding municipal boundaries, is at the top of the hierarchy of environmental protection, which Jennifer reinforced. The interesting thing about monitoring our environmental protection policies, however, is that we don't seem to be very good at identifying metrics to evaluate our progress on those policies. We can see here for our regional growth strategies monitoring dashboard that this particular dimension of the growth strategy has no metrics assigned, no information at this point, no one how to do that. Now, following the hierarchy of focusing growth to within municipal serviced areas within the region, and the next tier of land management is to focus growth further within the municipal boundaries. We saw Kelowna doing that. This is our way of doing it here in Courtney. This slide is showing Courtney's growth centers, orange, red, dark yellow, and how they sit within this larger context of key environmentally sensitive area corridors. So this is very conceptual, obviously, the blue and the green. On the right is the land use objectives page within the OCP, emphasizing some key smart growth principles, such as locating growth away from hazard lands, agriculture, environmental, guiding growth into growth centers to create more 10-minute neighborhoods, and ensuring growth takes place within the existing boundary. And these objectives may seem quite intuitive and obvious, but it's important to have these enshrined, as it's not that long ago that boundary annexations were relatively routine in our particular community. And now there's a heightened understanding of the implications of those extensions, which frankly, the asset management implications, like the financial ones, are the most broadly convincing, as Jennifer's presentation shared with Kelowna's model city infrastructure. The city and many people in the community are proud of our OCP's approach to growth management, and I must recognize how important the context is out of which these policies emerge. So our council was decisive in directing that climate action and reconciliation be lenses through which to conduct the work. And they were voicing the desires clearly of the community, because we saw that emerge naturally through the vision and the goals themselves. You can see that in the wordles and the actual vision and goals. And then the paragraphs on the right include the Comox First Nation values and teachings, which are acknowledged in our OCP with KFN's permission, because they're so relevant to the concept of land use and stewardship of land in a land stewardship document such as an OCP. Now, this slide here makes no reference to nature. However, it is these processes captured here that are critical to the successful implementation of an OCP, where we see that it is ultimately the voice of the public, shown at left, that informs a plan that council and city staff can implement, shown at right. And the image in the center was included in our OCP to recognize and communicate the importance of the OCP being included in all the corporate processes of local government, in the annual cycles of strategic planning, departmental work planning, city budget, financial planning, and then reporting out to the community in our annual reports. So this represents how important it is that this work is stewarded at every incremental phase of a local government's operations to be successful. Now, getting back to nature specifically, here are Courtney's natural environment objectives written in as plain a language as possible. And as Deborah Curran reminded us last week, these objectives are the foundation to successful enactment of biodiversity protection tools such as urban forest strategies and EDPAs. So I'll shift into more technical info. With this community planning context, we can see that EDPs, a favorite tool to discuss in forums such as these, become a more site-specific and operational construction management tool. And Jennifer's examples, I think, highlighted that as well. Here is the mapping of our known environmentally sensitive areas, which are presented in the two map categories, aquatic and terrestrial. The Comox estuary floodplain and the watersheds are shown as well. And I'll just say the watershed layer is not actually in and of itself an environmentally sensitive area, but we thought it's important to show the watersheds for education purposes and to signal the importance of considering and evaluating cumulative impacts. The terrestrial features for us fall into many of the sensitive ecosystem inventory categories from the late 90s, early 2000s. And then our latest update in 2014, so that is quite getting already kind of old, is a regional disturbance assessment was led by our local conservation communities. So Comox Valley Conservation Partnership initiated the project to do a land disturbance assessment with the CBRD and the Ministry of Environment and Vancouver Island University, money from Real Estate Foundation. So just a lot of gratitude to those dedicated groups doing that out there, those ENGOs. And then we've got like some SARA layers, some CDC layers, and then tree stewardship information. And then the other thing that's quite significant on here, you see on the right, the extent of green is the data that the city commissioned, which was the urban forest strategy, LIDAR, canopy, and species analysis, which is defined as significant forest ecosystems. And I'll talk about this in my next slide. So this is relatively new ESA information that we incorporated into our 2022 update. And this is based on, like I said, LIDAR 2016. To evaluate canopy cover and inform ecosystem connectivity opportunity areas shown in purple. Here are some photos of what connectivity looks like in our community, just so you can see it. These are more natural. These are in a more urban environment. This is sometimes, what remains after development. And we understand from conservation biology that patch areas of 10 hectares are of particular value. We have a lot that are a lot smaller than that, but still they form part of the network that we'd want to strengthen. Here's an example of a subdivision landscape just before and after development, just to give perspective on how those changes can happen. To understand our terrestrial environmentally sensitive areas, like I said, the LIDAR analysis was used. You can see a gradient of color showing where changes have occurred in different timelines in our community. This work was very helpful at telling a powerful story about forest loss within our boundaries. And I found the public really gravitated to this type of information. And they could see that there'd been accelerating loss in recent years, just the different colors. And I'll just note too that it's important to note that canopy change can also mean growth of canopies, such as shown in the green areas. The urban forest strategy included some ground truthing by arborists and biologists, and this map shows areas of significant stands, unique features of special consideration that contribute to ecological as well as community character values. So, and this includes old growth recruitment, which there are some 60-plus-year-old forests today that may not have always had the highest ecosystem complexity, but which we know could have a chance to if we protect those areas. So after looking at the changing forest canopy and the location of significant stands, staff were eager to understand the potential for connectivity corridors. This was not part of the original scope of the urban forest strategy, but I would note that this work was relatively easy to tack on if you already have LIDAR data. So this may be an opportunity for those doing urban forest type of work or EDP updates. 3 species were identified to inform these connectivity model parameters, each representing different forest characteristics. So aquatic, riparian, or just moist mature forest from the red-legged frog, mature coniferous forest from the red squirrel, and larger patches of mature forest from the brown creeper. And the goal was to find patches of existing forest that meet the habitat needs of all 3 representative species, and therefore represent an opportunity for other species to benefit from this corridor. So they were chosen as particular types of indicator species, if you like. This analysis identified across all 3 species both the key patches that are important, as well as hubs, and then important stepping stones within the landscape. And they did analyze outside the city's boundaries to make sure the connectivity can continue out, beyond the boundaries. And pinch points have been identified where barriers to connectivity exist today. So these tend to be major roads, built up areas, recent cleared areas. Now, these areas overlay very well with the environmentally sensitive areas, especially riparian corridors, and they identified additional connection opportunities to protect and restore a more robust habitat network for more species. And these data were used to inform the EDP terrestrial mapping, as I mentioned in the purple. And this opportunity, the word opportunity aspect is a key term, as the development guidelines have been structured to require restoration, even in situations where today there is no ESA. So we actually haven't seen an application come in since we enacted this. So I am still quite curious to see how that presents itself on an actual application. Like, what do you do if it's just literally a paved site and we're making the case for restoration? But we have the regulatory framework to support us if that opportunity presents itself. And Deborah Kern was really reinforcing that last week as well. Now, getting into the EDP framework, ours includes standard guidelines such as avoidance of ESAs in general, retaining key habitat features, restoring disturbed areas, permanent fencing, environmental monitoring. We actually take securities for the monitoring itself so that if the applicant is not doing the monitoring, that we can hire professionals to do the monitoring. But I'll highlight a few of the guidelines that we did not encounter as frequently in our EDP research at the time. Maybe this has evolved, but we know that not all ESAs can be mapped. So we require an environmental impact assessment for any property over 1 acre, 4,000 meters squared. So using the Develop with Care bioinventory checklist can be the basis of that particular EIA. Just to confirm whether presence absence of an environmentally sensitive area. And then if there is one, then they have to do a more rigorous environmental impact assessment with our own terms of reference, which actually were borrowed from the Okanagans. This requirement includes if property was previously disturbed. And as I said, we have written that we could require an EDP for restoration purposes only. Now, registered professional biologists, and we actually require RP bios. We don't accept qualified environmental professionals, but RP bios are to evaluate for connectivity within their environmentally impact assessments. And we've experienced that methods are definitely needed to evaluate connectivity opportunities. So for instance, RP bios will often ask the city, what exactly do you want us to evaluate? And we'll say, please use your professional judgment to describe and evaluate the connectivity opportunity. And then they'll say, well, what land do you want to preserve on the parcel and how wide should the area be? And we'll say, please look at the broader context of landscape pattern to make a recommendation. And there's this back and forth of trying to figure out exactly what should be evaluated, as these are newer types of ESAs and don't have those standard methods that professionals are accustomed to using, I think probably particularly in an urban context. So I think this tension we experience is a symptom of the ongoing challenge of understanding cumulative ecological impact, which hopefully the technical professionals and regulatory professionals can work on together. And I'd love that if anyone wants to reach out. We also have guidelines that direct the protection of potential nesting and perch trees for raptors along the estuary and within the vicinity of nests, not just the perch and nest trees of today. And we have been utilizing third-party review of environmental impact assessments on more complex EDPs lately to provide that additional expertise to the city as a regulator and application reviewer. And we bill this cost back to the applicant, given the city's lack of this type of technical expertise, and in accordance with our development procedures bylaw, which states that that could be part of the application process. We also have a guideline that directs a 30-meter setback along all wrapper applicable watercourses. And I know that's a very exciting thing to say, but I have a few caveats. So this guideline was directed by our council when creating our last OCP and was seen as an opportunity to offer additional and precautionary protection of wrapper water bodies, as we all know that climate change will pose increasing stress to those systems and more land can assist in ensuring their viability. During the OCP consultation, ministry staff were very pleased to see these standards, as they felt the wrapper methods were likely not sufficient at protecting against climate change. However, a court case out of Cowichan Regional District is causing us to re-examine our authority to have such a setback requirement that exceeds the wrapper legislation. And that case went as far as the BC Supreme Court and concluded that, in broad terms, a local government may not refuse a development permit if the RAR methods are met. So this case was within the RAR system, the older system. Now we have the wrapper, for those who are following that. So maybe that's part of the nuance of what people can do today to create regs, but we are aware that the wrapper allows local governments to meet or exceed that standard. But we now at the City of Courtenay just need to review this case law and how it affects that ability. And I know for a fact we'll be examining this this year as part of our OCP review. And I'm happy to connect with anyone else working on this topic. My email's at the end of the presentation. So quickly, I know I'm running out of time here. Just an acknowledgement that we have an actual urban forest strategy. I talked a lot about the mapping within it, but it contains strategies on the importance of monitoring canopy cover, protecting the critical urban forests, and working with neighborhoods to determine their forest goals, and supporting dynamic urban forest on infill properties. That's my next slide, related to our tree bylaw, and then integrating city trees in asset management planning and leadership and partnership. So with our tree bylaw, just acknowledging we have some highlights here. The first and second points, the philosophical foundation for our proposed tree bylaw is that every property should be treated in the same, just the same, so that to ensure the trees are spread throughout the community, not to penalize a property that has many trees on it, and to ensure that all properties are contributing to the community's share of the services that trees provide. So we have something called a tree density target that has to be met. Properties over an acre are to retain healthy mature trees wherever possible. And then for properties smaller than an acre, they can meet their tree density target however they like, retaining, replanting, or cash in lieu, because infill can be more challenging to grow within. And we will be reviewing this tree bylaw this year on some housekeeping matters, and also how to have better monitoring inside, like Jennifer's example of that ponderosa pine that died due to construction impact. We want to be avoiding that, possibly through more city monitoring. Just recognizing that small scale multi-unit legislation, housing legislation, it's great from smart growth point of view. And we know that it does not affect environmental protection abilities, but it very explicitly is acknowledging that local governments should not be creating too many barriers to this density, including requiring landscape requirements. So just signaling that this is one of those contexts, this changing context we're working in. The very fastest shout outs, I just need to acknowledge the Comox Valley Land Trust. All our nonprofits do so much work, NGOs in this community. They did amazing mapping in our community. We have Project Watershed, who's literally unpaving Paradise, an old sawmill site, raising the money. This is important for our flood protection, so there's utilitarian value. Our community, Cumberland Forest Society, they are constantly holding community events, science pub nights to explore ecological concepts. It's just, this to me is really the importance, the conservation culture work that makes sure these policies have longevity. I myself did a lot of workshops with our community in our OCP creation, and connecting with people on their street. There's just nothing like it. It's a great way to expose people to these ideas and learn from people. This is just my reflecting slide. I think I'll let you kind of glance at it, but I'm gonna stop sharing because I'm out of time. So thank you very much.
I'm really sorry to pressure you, Nancy, but we are running very short on time. So I thought we should save at least 5 minutes for questions. And there is, I've been monitoring the question and answer in the chat. So let's get to at least one question because it's got a huge number of votes. And the question is, and it's addressed to both of you, are you getting developers to pay for and monitor and maintain wildlife crossings? Example, underpass culverts. I won't read the full question, but there are two very high interest in wildlife crossings. So maybe I'll turn it over to Jennifer first and then to Nancy, if that's okay.
Sure thing. I would say that we don't have a lot of them because we're trying to avoid interactions in those locations. So when we do have them, they are considered part of the DP process. So there's the 3+ year monitoring requirement that is maintained through the performance security process. So as Nancy mentioned, we hold an amount of money that's equivalent to that monitoring contract cost for that period.
Yeah.
Nancy, I think avoidance would be our first approach too. Like, why do you need the underpass? If it's already in a large greenfield development and that's going to be private infrastructure, maybe it's private strata road or something else there, then I'd say absolutely. That would all be part of the sensitivity. The guidelines were pretty clear on, you know, to do connectivity, you may need specialized features in your development. I could see crossings being part of that underpass. If it's part of like trying to restore to proper, you know, across a road, an existing public road or something like that, I think then the tool would be different. And we're talking probably like a capital project coming out of the public purse. And yeah, so those are my thoughts.
Okay. And just to continue on that, what Nancy said there is that it does become the public infrastructure if it's part of a road and it's on public property. I mean, in some cases there might be strata roads that have these features, but from my experience, it's been public roads, and so they do become the city's responsibility. So we've had barriers for amphibians to encourage them to go to the culvert. Okay. And in those cases, damage to those barrier structures has been fallen on the city to have to maintain and repair.
Okay. There are actually 10 questions, and we only have 3 minutes. But suspecting this, we did already talk with both Nancy and Jen and asked if we can collect the questions and if they would answer it instead of rushing through and getting a quick answer now. I think we'll do that. We'll collate the questions, we'll share it with Jen and Nancy, and then when we can share it with everybody else, because there's a couple of last minute things that I wanted to get through. Most of all, to thank both Nancy and Jennifer for a couple of really, really inspiring presentations. I'm sure all of us are struggling with this issue, and so I think this would be really great to follow through. I wanted to say that there is a survey that we would like you to fill out before as you're exiting the presentation. But I also wanted to draw your attention that this presentation is part of a series of presentations that go into the third week in March. The next presentation that we have coming up is mitigation policy and planning and the habitat offset decision support tool. It was touched a little bit both in Jennifer's presentation and maybe in Nancy's presentation. So I think this will be of great interest to everyone. So we welcome you to that. And again, apologies for running out of time for questions. We wanted to keep it to the hour of the lunchtime, which really, I think, has forced us to skip through time. And I also don't want to go beyond the 1 o'clock, recognizing everybody's time. So thank you once again. This has been great, and hope to see you all next week.